Okay, let's go over some really important questions when you're building your webinar funnel. These are questions you may have thought of or may not have thought of, but it's because we deal with so many clients putting together webinar funnels. I want to go over some of the more common questions that you either might ask or should be asking. So, first of all, for the presentation, should you do a live webinar and use recording, or should you record it on your own from the beginning? So, in other words, that last option, just to explain it, would be sit down at the computer after you've created your presentation, hit record, and pretend like you're doing a webinar, and then use that. And the answer is that you should do live webinars and use it as recording. There's a lot of different reasons, but it's going to, number one, it's going to sound better. So as you do multiple live webinars, you're going to get one that you feel like that was it. That was a really, really solid one, and you're going to take that recording, and that would be the best one to use. Another really strong reason is because no matter how much time and consideration you put into your presentation, things are going to change. They should change as you go along. So you're going to get better, you're going to get more fluid, you're going to get feedback from people, you're going to notice certain slides that need to come out or need to change, certain wording, and so you're going to get certain ideas. And by the fourth or fifth or sixth one, it's going to morph from what you started with to something a lot more powerful. At least that's what I've experienced. But at the very least, after you do 4 or 5 of them, you're going to have one of those that just is really going to be a standout, head and shoulders better than the other ones. It's going to sound a lot better when you're doing it live than if you just sat down at the computer and just started recording. All right. There's another big reason why you want to do the live webinar route is because you want to make sure that your webinar converts. This is probably the biggest reason. You want to make sure that your webinar presentation converts, that your messaging is right before you go through the time and energy to automate it, right? And so if you're completely starting fresh, you just have an idea of putting together a webinar funnel, great. Where you want to eventually go is automating the webinar. But initially what you want to do is you want to make sure that your message converts, your offer is strong. People want what it is that you're selling. And the best way to do that, rather than going through the process of automating it, what you want to do is you want to make sure that it works first and then automate it. All right, so moving on. So a question that you need to ask for yourself is, what are you going to do with the people that register and they don't attend? It's an unfortunate fact that no matter how strong your email sequence is, more people are going to skip attending the live presentation. And by live, I'm using air quotes here. They're going to, whether you're doing it as a true live webinar or an Evergreen webinar, they're going to miss attending live, and they're just going to wait for the replay, or they're not going to show up. So a smaller percentage are actually going to show up. So the question is, what are you going to do for those that don't attend? Now, I'm not going to tell you you should do this or you shouldn't do that. Different people do it different ways. A lot of people, I would say the majority of people, will send the replay to the people that didn't attend. However, others have a real hardline stance where they say, no, look, I want people to be on this webinar, and I'm going to not send them the replay. I'm going to send them a re-invite and try to get them to re-register for the webinar and to actually attend. And I have a whole sequence that does that. So either one is fine, but you need to decide right off the bat, because it's going to how you synchronize your emails with the deadline is going to be determined partly by whether you're going to send them the replay if they don't attend, or if you're just going to try to get them to re-register. And we'll cover that later, but I just want you to go ahead and think about that. Now, does it matter which webinar software you use, does it matter which webinar software platform or email software that you use? So I use Easy Webinar and ActiveCampaign, or I use EverWebinar and Drip, Infusionsoft. What is the right combination? Will my software work? And the answer is that no matter what software stack you're using, almost no matter what, it's going to work great. We integrate with so many different types of apps, including, at the bottom here, you see Zapier. So in another training, I'll show you how to set up Zapier, and that opens up hundreds, if not thousands, of other different combinations. So almost no matter what combination you're using, it's going to work out. It's going to work out fine. Now, what I would recommend is that if you have any doubts, you can contact my team through live chat, and we're very accessible. And you can ask us, hey, I'm setting up a webinar, just want to make sure I can use Easy Webinar and ConvertKit, or whatever your marketing stack is. All right, so moving on from there. For the emails, should I use the webinar software or should I use my own email software? So here's what I typically recommend. Again, this is a recommendation. You don't have to do it this way. But I recommend that for everything leading up to the actual webinar, when you want them to show up and be there, I would use the automated email sent out by your webinar platform, whether that's EasyWebinar, EverWebinar, Demio, or whatever you're using. And then after that, I would recommend using your own email software platform, ActiveCampaign, Drip, Aweber, Infusionsoft, what have you, for everything that happens after that and before the deadline. Why? Well, you've got a lot more flexibility with what you can do in terms of triggers and moving someone from the prospect list to the buyer's list and doing various different things. Now, again, just a recommendation. We do have people who just use the webinar platform emails for the entire thing, but my basic recommendation is this. Now, how do I synchronize my emails and my webinar? Now, this is the biggest challenge with automated webinars and with deadlines. Now, there is no better platform than Deadline Funnel for synchronizing whatever email system you're using, whatever webinar platform you're using, and having an automated, authentic, real deadline. But it is a challenge, and let me explain why. A lot of webinar registration platforms will give you the opportunity to set it up so that someone can choose 2 different dates. As you can see in this example, we've got a Tuesday and a Wednesday. So that means that in one situation, they would register on one day. There's the webinar indicated by the second hash mark, and then there's the deadline. Well, what about someone else comes along a few minutes later, registers on the same day? Let's call it a Tuesday. Both Bob and Susan register on a Tuesday. Bob chooses the Tuesday, later that day, Tuesday webinar, and Susan chooses the Wednesday webinar. Well, if we're doing it based on when they register, that's going to be a little bit challenging. So now what we really need to do is we need to choose a triggering event that's a predictable number of days from the deadline. So if you're going to set it up to synchronize everything, you want to think about, okay, what is the event that's a predictable distance or time distance, number of days or hours from the deadline. So if you're going to offer multiple days, like a Tuesday and a Wednesday, a Thursday and a Friday, etc., later today or sometime tomorrow, then what we recommend is that you set it up so that it's triggered based on when the webinar happens. All right, so whenever they choose, if Susan registers on a Tuesday for a Wednesday webinar, that Wednesday when that webinar happens in the automated webinar software platform, that's the trigger that starts everything. Both the emails that go out after post-webinar and also the information to start the deadline funnel tracking. And that way, whether someone chooses later today or tomorrow, it doesn't matter because it's based on the number of days between the webinar and the deadline. All right, so here's how. So basically what you can do, whether you're using EverWebinar or EasyWebinar or other platforms, a lot of these systems have the ability to apply a tag in your CRM or email software. And you can do it where you can say, okay, when the webinar happens, when someone attends, apply a tag. Now you might also include apply a tag when they do not attend. Remember the question that I was asking before that you just need to answer for yourself, which is what am I going to do? What are you going to do with the folks that register but they don't attend? Well, with EverWebinar, for example, and I believe you can do this with EasyWebinar, you can say, okay, if someone doesn't attend, I still want to apply a tag. It could be the same tag or it could be a different tag. And both of those tags could trigger an event that then tells Deadline Funnel, hey, bob@gmail.com needs to have a 5-day deadline. And so they go on to a sequence that's 5 days long, and there's a 5-day deadline. Everything's all synchronized up. Okay, so webinar software logic, apply a tag when they attend. So it goes to Drip, Drip says when tags start a 5-day sequence, and the first step in that sequence is to send an HTTP post, other systems call it a webhook, over to Deadline Funnel, and Deadline Funnel receives that information and says, got it, gonna set a deadline for that subscriber. So think about it like this. If the drip email sequence, if your email sequence is the same number of days long as you set up in Deadline Funnel, and you start them at exactly the same time, then they're going to end at the same time, and everything's synchronized. You just need to figure out what the trigger is going to be, and the trigger is going to be when the webinar happens. So think of it like a series of dominoes. The event is that the webinar happens and they attend. So that domino knocks over the next one. Apply the tag in the email software. The email software says, oh, they got the tag. Next domino, put them into this sequence, X number of days long. And the first step in that sequence is send a webhook or HTTP post to Deadline Funnel. Deadline Funnel says, got it. It's going to be X number of days long for that deadline. Everything is all synchronized up. Now, some webinar software systems don't integrate as well with email systems. So, for example, you might be using EverWebinar, and you might be using some less popular email software. So what do? Because if EverWebinar isn't set up to send this webhook to, apply a tag in your email software, or maybe your email software doesn't have tags, then what are you going to do? Well, so there's a couple different options. So option number one is that you can use Zapier, and it's really the same thing. So the webinar software might be able to trigger a Zap, and then the Zap might be able to set something up in Aweber, for example. And so also Zapier, that same Zap, could trigger a Deadline Funnel. Now, if you're thinking, whoa, we're getting into the deep end of the pool, don't worry, just contact my team. My job is to just make sure that I kind of get you the framework so that you understand what's supposed to happen. The big takeaway here is that you want the email sequence that happens when the webinar kicks off. You want the webinar to kick off the email sequence and the email system to send the info to Deadline Funnel so that everything starts at the same time. If the email sequence is the same length as the deadline and Deadline Funnel and they both start at the same time, everything's synchronized. That's the big takeaway. And you can do it using either connecting the various platforms to each other, or you can use Zapier as a glue to make sure that this happens. Option number two is that you could limit your webinar to just one specific day. Now, some people don't want to do this, but it is an option. So if you wanted to, you could, no matter when they show up, you could say, look, there's not an option for tomorrow, there's just an option for later today. The reason why this works is because if the registration only gives you the option for later today is in quotes, later today, then we know that when they register, the register event and the webinar date are going to be the same day, and so it's an equal number of days. So the distance between the registration event and the deadline is the same number of times, same number of days every single time, no matter when someone shows up.